It began, as many battlefield myths do, in the quiet space between certainty and fear. A German infantryman in the east wrote of a sound he could not name. A hammer from the sky, he called it, a blow that arrived before the mind could understand it. It was not the cracking of rifles or the deep concussion of artillery he had grown accustomed to. It was something cleaner, faster, almost mechanical in its finality. Long after the page yellowed, his words remained. We hit the ground before we understood we had already been struck. Its first recorded appearance came far from Europe, under the hard light of the North African desert in 1942. A German supply column, moving in loose formation across the sand, never reached the ridge ahead. Men later described how the trucks seemed to disintegrate in motion, metal folding inward as though carved apart by invisible blades. No aircraft was seen. No enemy lines were close. Only the echoes remained, sharp and repetitive, fading across the wadi like the tail of a passing storm. Confused officers filed their reports with unusual brevity. They spoke of a single gun firing with the continuity of lightning, long, unbroken flashes of destruction rolling across the horizon. The weapon seemed less fired than unleashed. Veterans of earlier campaigns found themselves confronted with something they had no language for, a rate of fire that blurred events into one unbroken moment. Soon its sound signature carried its own meaning. To German infantry, it became an omen whispered in dugouts and foxholes. If you hear it, you are already in its sights. The weapon's voice traveled farther than its bullets, and yet the two felt indistinguishable. Hearing was the first step toward reckoning. Even the Luftwaffe, accustomed to the dangers of the sky, spoke of it with a rare edge of respect. Pilots described the rounds as punches that tore through airframes as if the metal itself had surrendered. The desert sun, the altitude, the distance, none of it seemed to blunt the weapon's reach. And then the lens tightens. One weapon, one design, one man who shaped it, John Browning. A single question now hangs over the battlefield. How did one gun earn such universal German hatred? Long before it carved its reputation into the deserts of North Africa or the skies over Europe, the M2 existed only as an answer to an unfinished question from another war. In the fading months of World War I, when new machines had overturned every assumption about battle, the U.S. Army realized that its rifles and machine guns could not keep pace with the changing world. Aircraft flew faster, armor thickened, and infantry pressed forward behind steel. The battlefield had entered a new age, and the weapons meant to defend against it had not. John Browning, already respected for designs that had changed American firepower, treated these reports not as complaints but as a directive. Soldiers at the front row of enemy aircraft passing overhead unchallenged, of lightly armored cars moving with impunity, of advancing infantry whose momentum could not be stopped by small-caliber fire. What they needed was not another rifle. They needed a new category of bullet, one that did not merely wound but halted motion itself. The answer emerged in the form of the .50 Browning machine gun round, a cartridge so large that early testers described it as more akin to artillery than ammunition. Perfecting it took time. Metallurgists struggled with pressures that shattered barrels, and designers wrestled with a weapon heavy enough to control the immense recoil. Yet each trial revealed something undeniable. When the .50 BMG struck its target, it erased doubt. Against steel, it carved. Against aircraft, it reached. Against infantry, it overwhelmed. By 1921, the M2 entered service, though few understood what had truly been created. Armies recovering from the Great War were inclined toward familiar solutions. Germany, rebuilding its arsenal in the 1930s, placed its faith in high-rate 7.9 weapons and specialized 20 aircraft cannons, efficient on paper, decisive in theory. The United States made a quieter choice. Without ceremony, it standardized the M2 across trucks, tanks, ships, and aircraft. No proclamation announced the decision. No prediction outlined its future impact. The weapon simply became part of the American arsenal, broadly placed, rarely questioned. Thus the stage formed for the conflict ahead, one empire investing in volume, the other in versatility. The first true collision between German doctrine and Browning's design came in the winter light of Tunisia, 1943. Reconnaissance units advancing along narrow ridgelines began reporting losses that defied their expectations. The desert was open, visibility clear, and the enemy still distant. Yet vehicles fell silent with the abruptness of machines struck from an invisible distance. Crews searched the terrain for artillery or dug in guns, but none appeared. Only the sharp rhythm of distant fire answered them, precise and unhurried. German machine gunners soon encountered the same riddle. The MG-34 and MG-42 dominated close and medium ranges with unmatched speed. But here, in the long stretches of North Africa, they discovered a weakness their manuals had not prepared them for. American positions sat beyond the reach of their own weapons, yet still exerted control. The M2's range bent the geometry of engagements. Hills that once offered safety became exposed ground, and the Wehrmacht's mastery of the middle distance no longer guaranteed advantage. Even armored cars, SD, KFZ, 222s and 231s that had scouted from France to the Caucasus, found themselves vulnerable. Their sloped plating, designed to shrug off rifle fire and fragments, revealed thin angles the .50 BMG exploited with unforgiving clarity. Rounds entered where theory claimed they should not, piercing vision slits, rupturing fuel tanks, and forcing crews to abandon vehicles that had carried them through years of war. Panzer grenadiers, trained to maneuver aggressively, discovered that the weapon's reach pinned them before their formations could unfold. Engagements began at distances previously considered irrelevant, and the tempo of movement, so central to German tactics, slowed under the weight of a gun that turned open ground into a corridor of risk. Above them, the Luftwaffe fared no better. Low-level pilots flying reconnaissance or ground attack sorties described an unfamiliar pattern of loss, not scattered damage, but entire wings sheared away under converging streams of .50 fire. Aircraft built to withstand rifle calibers found themselves undone by a weapon that treated metal as a temporary obstacle. In this environment, rumor moved faster than doctrine. Soldiers spoke quietly of an American gun that angered the air, a phrase born not of poetry but of observation. What began as confusion soon hardened into fear, a recognition that the battlefield itself had changed shape. And in the minds of German commanders, an unsettling question emerged. If this was merely the first encounter, what would follow when the weapon appeared in greater numbers? To understand Germany's early encounters with the M2, one must first understand the doctrine that shaped its expectations. The Wehrmacht entered the war guided by a belief in superior firepower, not through sheer caliber, but through engineering finesse. Central to this was the MG-34, and later the MG-42, weapons whose mechanical precision allowed them to fire at extraordinary rates. In German thinking, control of the battlefield belonged to the army that could impose its rhythm, and these machine guns delivered that rhythm with a relentless, staccato certainty. Commanders across the army trusted that mobility and volume would compensate for limitations in range. Their doctrine emphasized rapid maneuver, supported by weapons that could lay down such dense bursts of fire that enemy units would break before the Germans themselves were threatened. It was a philosophy shaped by the experiences of 1939, 1940, and 1941, years in which German formations advanced quickly, seized initiative, and overwhelmed opponents who could not match their speed or cohesion. Against such a backdrop, the idea that caliber alone might decide a fight felt outdated, even archaic. This confidence extended into armored doctrine. Panzer units operated with the assumption that their Maskenengineers, positioned in hull and turret, would dominate infantry and light vehicles across both desert and European terrain. The armor itself, though thin on many reconnaissance and support vehicles, was believed sufficient when paired with the rapid, suppressive fire of German machine guns. Protection and lethality were understood as functions of tempo, not thickness or power. In the air, similar ideas took shape. Luftwaffe strategists argued that fighters like the Bf-109 possessed ample firepower to shred any American aircraft that dared approach the front. Its centrally mounted 20mm cannons were proven weapons, capable of tearing through the lightly built airframes of early war Allied planes. To these planners, American designs appeared fragile, and American gunnery outdated, a mismatch that favored Germany both technologically and tactically. These assumptions colored German views of the Browning design. Engineers examining captured examples dismissed it as technically primitive, too heavy, too old, too mechanically simple to match the refined cadence of German guns. They noted that the design predated the Third Reich itself, and concluded that a weapon born in the 1920s could not meaningfully challenge machines crafted from the industrial precision of the 1930s. Confidence hardened into certainty. Germany possessed the superior tools. Reinforcing this belief were the victories of the early war. In Poland, France, the Balkans, and the opening stages of Barbarossa, German weapons consistently outperformed their adversaries. The MG3. 4 and MG42 shaped the infantry fight. Panzer formations achieved breakthroughs at will. The Luftwaffe held the skies with its disciplined, cannon-armed fighters. Each success strengthened the quiet conviction that German design philosophy was not merely adequate, it was correct. Yet beneath this confidence lay a miscalculation that no engineer's slide rule could correct. German planners understood performance, but underestimated something far less visible: the scale of America's industrial depth and the consequences of placing a versatile weapon in the hands of an industry capable of building it by the millions. And as the war expanded, that miscalculation would reveal itself with stark clarity. The next section shows how quickly confidence begins to fracture. While Germany divided its arsenal into narrow specialties, light machine guns for squads, heavy cannons for aircraft, and intermediate weapons for armored cars, the United States embraced a different philosophy. To American planners, simplicity was not a compromise but a strategic advantage. Early in the interwar years, they concluded that a universal machine gun, standardized across the entire military, would reduce training time, streamline logistics, and create a familiar tool for every branch. The M2 was more than a weapon. It was a solution to the complexity of modern war. This thinking became visible first in armored units. American tanks, even those lightly armored by European standards, mounted multiple M2s across their turrets and hulls. For the crews, these guns extended the tank's reach far beyond what its main cannon could practically engage. A Sherman could suppress infantry, halt trucks, damage light armor, and contest low-flying aircraft, all without expending a single shell. The weapon made even modest vehicles appear larger on the battlefield than their steel would suggest. Infantry formations experienced the same transformation. An M2 set on its tripod, anchoring a defensive line, offered a level of control over open ground that had previously required artillery or specialized anti-materiel guns. Units learned to direct the weapon not only against enemy troops, but against structures, vehicles, and field fortifications. What once demanded an entire section of heavy weapons could now be answered by a single crew, trained on a system standardized across the Army. At sea, the gun's adaptation was even more striking. Naval vessels, from destroyers to small patrol crafts, mounted M2s in long rows, creating layers of defense against incoming aircraft. When Japanese dive bombers or torpedo planes broke through outer screens, these belts of .50 caliber fire waited like a final barrier. Sailors spoke of the sound not as a single weapon, but as a wall, steady, disciplined, and unbroken across the deck. Aircraft designers, confronted with the rapid acceleration of aerial combat, embraced the M2 with mathematical precision. Wings were built around it. Turrets rotated to feed it. Ammunition belts snaked through fuselages in carefully calculated paths, ensuring that the streams of fire would converge at exactly the right distance. When 8 M2s lined the wings of a P-47 or P-51, the effect was not simply firepower but geometry, a calculated intersection of trajectories that turned a fleeting burst into overwhelming force. Around the weapon, an ecosystem emerged. Specialized mounts stabilized it on vehicles. Optical sights refined its accuracy. Belt-linking machines fed its appetite for continuous fire. Doctrine evolved to integrate the weapon into every layer of the battlefield, ground, sea, and air, until the gun became less a component and more a framework around which American firepower cohered. It was an idea expressed in steel, a single tool, endlessly adaptable, taught to soldiers, sailors, and airmen alike. From a distance, Germany began to notice the pattern. Reports from Tunisia, Sicily, and the Pacific all pointed to the same conclusion. The M2 was everywhere. What German engineers had dismissed as technically primitive was revealing itself as strategically elegant. Its value was not found in its age, but in its adaptability, the rare quality that allows a weapon to move effortlessly across every domain of war. And as these observations accumulated, an unsettling realization took shape. This gun was not an accessory to American strategy. It was becoming its foundation. What happened when such a foundation was multiplied across an industrial giant would soon become impossible to ignore. Understand why the M2 reshaped battlefields from Tunisia to the Pacific. One must step inside the machine itself, into the rhythm, the recoil, and the quiet precision of a design that appeared simple but hid layers of mechanical intent. German soldiers often remarked on the gun's measured tempo, mistaking its slower cyclic rate for a weakness. Yet that tempo was deliberate. By firing fewer rounds per minute than the MG-34 or MG-42, the M2 stabilized its own coil, allowing each shot to ride the same predictable path toward the target. At long range, where battle becomes a contest not of speed but of steadiness, this trait mattered far more than raw volume. The gun spoke in deliberate syllables, each one landing where it was meant to land. Central to its dominance was the .50 Browning machine gun round, an uncompromising cartridge born of the final year of World War I in terms of energy. It stood in a category no German infantry weapon could match. The 7.92 rounds of German machine guns carried speed, but the .50 carried authority. It penetrated where others deflected. It reached where others fell short. In field tests, it punched through an inch of steel at close range and still traveled onward with lethal intent. On the battlefield, this meant that light armor, aircraft skins, fortified positions, and even structural beams were no longer obstacles but temporary delays. When a .50 struck, the discussion ended. At the heart of the M2's reliability lay Browning's short trecoil operating system, a design so elegantly balanced that it seemed indifferent to the world around it. Sandstorms in North Africa, monsoon rains in Burma, or the frozen mud of the Ardennes, none of these environments silenced it. German crews, accustomed to the careful maintenance requirements of their own weapons, found it difficult to understand how a gun so large could demand so little. But Browning had engineered movement into every component. The barrel and bolt recoiled together, unlocking with a timing that resisted fouling and allowed the weapon to function even when conditions stripped lesser guns of their precision. Its adaptability became a second form of reliability. Mounted on a tripod, the M2 served as a long-range anchor. Placed atop a tank, it extended armor's reach into the sky and across valleys. Fixed to a jeep, it transformed reconnaissance units into sudden sources of overwhelming fire. And when adapted for aircraft, it became part of a geometric solution, a weapon whose placement in wings and turrets created webs of converging fire that reshaped aerial combat. Few weapons in the war could shift their roles so effortlessly. The M2 moved where it was needed, fitting into both doctrine and improvisation with equal ease. Barrel longevity further distinguished it from German designs. The MG-42, despite its brilliance, required frequent barrel changes to maintain its blistering rate of fire. Crews carried asbestos gloves, spare barrels, and a constant awareness of overheating. By contrast, the M2's slower rate allowed extended firing without immediate danger of warping or failure. Its thicker barrel, heavy and deliberate, absorbed the heat of long engagements. In defensive operations, this trait became decisive. An M2 could hold a line or deny a valley with uninterrupted pressure, while its German counterparts cycled through the exhausting ritual of barrel maintenance. Behind the battlefield performance lay the quiet power of American industry. Factories from Connecticut to Ohio produced receivers and barrels with a level of interchangeability unmatched at the time. Parts built months apart in separate facilities could be assembled without adjustment. This consistency meant that field repairs, often improvised under fire, succeeded with a confidence unknown to many armies. A gun damaged in Sicily could be rebuilt in a workshop in Naples using components shipped from Detroit or Milwaukee. In a global war, such reliability was not a convenience. It was a strategic multiplier. German analysts studying captured examples came to an unsettling conclusion. The M2 was not merely powerful. It was not simply reliable. It was, in practical terms, unbreakable. Every method they used to classify Allied weapons, by caliber, by rate of fire, by intended role, failed to encompass the M2's nature. It blurred categories, stepped across them, and resisted their attempts to define its limits. And as this realization took hold in the upper commands, a new question began to form, one that would lead directly into the turning point of the war's firepower race. If this was what the weapon already was, what would happen when the Americans found ways to use it even more effectively? When the air war over Europe reached its height, the American bomber did not enter the sky as a single machine, but as a constellation of weapons, each aircraft carrying more M2 Browning machine guns than many infantry companies possessed in total. A B-17 bristled with 13 of them, each strategically placed to cover blind spots and overlapping angles. The larger B-24 carried a similar arsenal, forming an airborne geometry of defense that no earlier generation of aircraft had imagined. Before a single bomb fell, the sky itself had already been shaped by Browning's design. For Luftwaffe pilots, the first approach toward a bomber stream was an education in the limits of courage. Climbing to intercept at altitude, they watched as the formation resolved into a vast, shifting wall. Sunlight glinted from aluminum skins, but beneath that glint lay the darker truth. Dozens upon dozens of .50 caliber barrels already aligned, tracking every motion, every angle of attack. The Germans had met massed fire before on the ground. They had never encountered it suspended across miles of open air, moving steadily toward them. What awaited them was not a mere machine gun, it was a barrier. The principle that made this barrier so effective was harmonization. American engineers studied angles of approach, the field of fire from open skies, and the geometry of multiple gunners cooperating without ever seeing one another. Instead of isolated bursts, the B-17 and B-24 created interlocking spheres of fire. Each turret, blister, and window mount projected a beam of trajectory that overlapped with its neighbors. The formation became a three-dimensional shape, mathematically crafted, constantly shifting, through which a German fighter had to fly if it hoped to reach cannon range. Few airplanes could endure such a path for long. As the war progressed, Luftwaffe losses began to follow a troubling pattern. Pilots reported taking hits long before their 20 cannons came into effective distance. The approach itself became the battle. Several fighters were seen peeling away with wings perforated by streams of .50 caliber fire, their control surfaces torn or stiffened beyond recovery. Others pressed forward but arrived already wounded, hydraulics leaking, engines coughing, instruments failing. The damage often looked surgical. It came not from a single lucky hit, but from a series of precisely channeled bursts that converged in midair. Stories circulated within German units of aircraft returning to base with astonishing scars. Some bore dozens of clean, coin-sized punctures across their wings. Others returned with sections of fuselage shredded into frayed edges of aluminum. Mechanics came to recognize the signature: long, narrow channels carved by Browning rounds traveling at high velocity. Pilots spoke of the long bullets, a phrase that captured not their size, but the trajectories that seemed to follow them wherever they maneuvered. Inside the bombers, gunners experienced the fight through vibration and repetition. They described their aircraft as floating fortresses of Browning fire, a term that captured both the weight of their responsibility and the strange confidence provided by the guns. They worked in cold, thin air, exposed to pressure waves and the sudden brightness of tracer lines arcing outward. But their weapons rarely faltered. Even frostbitten hands could cycle the charging handles. Even damaged turrets continued to spit their rhythmic bursts. In an environment where machinery often failed, the M2 behaved with a composure that steadied the men who relied on it. Over time, an unspoken acknowledgement spread through the Luftwaffe. The .50 caliber was not a weapon to be outflown. It did not aim at a particular pilot or aircraft. It occupied space itself. Approaching a bomber formation meant entering an atmosphere altered by American firepower, one where the air shimmered with tracers and the cost of closing distance grew unsustainably high. The barrier did not simply resist attack, it exhausted it. And as Germany's veteran pilots dwindled, replaced by trainees with fewer hours and less margin for error, the psychological weight of that barrier grew heavier still. The next phase of the air war would reveal just how decisively this invisible wall reshaped the balance of the skies. The Normandy hedgerows offered terrain unlike anything the Americans had faced before: dense walls of earth and tangled vegetation that concealed German positions with deceptive ease. Machine gun nests, rifles, and Panzerfaust teams disappeared into the green maze, emerging only long enough to inflict sudden losses before falling back into shadow. Yet in this landscape of concealed danger, the M2 revealed another of its quiet strengths. Crews discovered that its heavy rounds could shear through brush and packed soil, peeling aside layers of foliage that had served the Germans so well. What began as blind fields of fire slowly opened, one burst at a time, until enemy positions, once invisible, stood exposed against the afternoon light. American half-tracks used the gun not as an ornament, but as a tool of deliberate reach. While German MG-42 teams fired with their signature ferocity, their effective range was bound by the limits of 7.92 ammunition. The M2 answered from distances beyond retaliation, pinning down entrenched crews who could neither close the gap nor safely reposition. In fields, along farm lanes, and at the edges of villages, the .50 created a margin of control that German infantry had not expected. The half-track, often criticized for its vulnerability, now served as a rolling platform whose primary strength was not armor but presence. This presence mattered most when confronting the armored carriers of the Panzer Grenadiers. Vehicles such as the SD, KFZ, 251, essential to German mechanized doctrine, were built to withstand rifles and light machine guns, not half-inch projectiles traveling with the kinetic energy of small artillery shells. The M2 could penetrate their side armor, rupture internal systems, or send fragments ricocheting through the troop compartment. In moments that felt almost unfair, carriers designed to move soldiers safely into battle instead became liabilities under the weight of Browning's rounds. German snipers, whose craft relied on concealment and patience, encountered a challenge they had not trained for. Brick walls, timber beams, and thick barn doors, traditional barriers that allowed them to fire and withdraw, offered little protection. The M2's bullets did not merely punch through these materials, they transformed them. Wood splintered into clouds of debris, masonry fractured, and the elevated hideouts that once offered security became traps. Snipers who believed they had chosen unseen angles found that the sound of a single burst could erase the boundary between their cover and the open air. Urban fighting intensified these effects. In towns from St. Lo to Aachen, M2 crews positioned their guns at intersections or on upper floors, sweeping entire streets with controlled bursts. The weapon denied movement, shaped the flow of infantry, and forced German units to reroute or delay engagements. Ambush tactics, so effective in tight European streets, carried new risks when the defenders could return fire through walls, shutters, vehicles, and the rubble itself. The gun did not simply dominate open fields, it redefined the geometry of combat in enclosed environments. Among captured troops, a stark phrase began to circulate: the destroyer of cover. It captured the shift with quiet accuracy. The M2 rendered traditional defensive assumptions unreliable. A stone wall no longer guaranteed safety. A vehicle no longer meant shelter. A sniper's perch no longer promised invisibility. For soldiers accustomed to calculating risk through familiar materials, wood, stone, steel, the weapon disrupted the mental maps that guided their survival. Gradually, a pattern emerged across the front. The .50 caliber was not a specialty tool, nor a weapon reserved for rare engagements. It operated across every environment, hedgerow, forest, field, and street, and in each it served the same purpose: to restore balance where German advantages in terrain, cover, or fire discipline once dictated the terms of battle. The struggle that marked the first weeks after D-Day gave way to clarity. The M2 was an equalizer, a force that shaped how soldiers moved, how they hid, and ultimately how they endured. And as the fighting pressed deeper into occupied Europe, another transformation approached, one that would reveal the full scale of American firepower on land, sea, and air. The turning point in the European air war did not unfold in a single battle, nor in a sudden collapse of German strength. It arrived instead with the appearance of two American fighters whose silhouettes would come to define the struggle for the skies: the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang. Each carried 8 M2 Browning machine guns, arranged with geometric precision along their wings. Together, they projected the same firepower as an entire bomber's defensive network, condensed into a single, swift aircraft. With their arrival, the Luftwaffe no longer faced unescorted bombers. It faced a system built around velocity, endurance, and the relentless reach of the .50 caliber. For years, German pilots had relied on hit-and-run attacks, exploiting the limited range of earlier Allied fighters. They climbed above the bomber streams, rolled into steep dives, unleashed their cannon bursts, and escaped before escorting aircraft could intervene. It was a method born of necessity and refined through experience. But the P-47 and P-51 changed the geometry of these encounters. Their extended range allowed them to accompany bombers deep into Germany, erasing the altitude and distance advantages upon which German tactics depended. More critically, their 8 Browning guns reached farther than expected, firing with such precision that German fighters found themselves under threat before their own weapons could come into play. The combined firepower of these 8 guns created a paradox. While the Luftwaffe favored 20 and 30 cannons for their destructive potential, those weapons suffered from limited ammunition, slower rates of fire, and trajectories that punished miscalculation. The American approach, volume married to accuracy, produced a lethality that matched or exceeded cannon bursts in practical combat. A 1-second trigger pull released more than 100 rounds, each one stabilized, predictable, and traveling on a path that allowed pilots to shape the impact point with minute adjustments. Accuracy became a force mull. Tipwire transforming streams of tracers into decisive blows. German pilots learned quickly that climbing to engage now carried new risks. In earlier phases of the war, they could ascend toward bomber formations with relative impunity, preparing for the moment when they would dive into attack. But the M2's long reach meant that even the climb was contested. Fighters attempting to gain altitude found themselves bracketed by incoming streams, lines of fire that, though distant, forced evasive action and disrupted carefully timed formations. Attacks that once unfolded in disciplined waves now dissolved into fragmented approaches, each pilot struggling to survive long enough to choose a direction, let alone a target. When the escorts finally engaged, the results were immediate and stark. German interceptors attempting to reach the bombers encountered the P-47s and P-51s first, and their margin for error narrowed to almost nothing. The Thunderbolts struck with brute resilience, absorbing hits that would have crippled lighter aircraft, while delivering 8-gun bursts powerful enough to tear apart wings and fuselages in seconds. The Mustang, lighter and sharper in maneuver, stalked enemy fighters with an ease that unsettled veterans accustomed to dictating the terms of combat. Together, they formed a shield that did not merely protect the bombers, it advanced with them. Losses mounted at a pace Germany could not replace. Experienced pilots, the backbone of earlier Luftwaffe successes, fell in increasing numbers. Trainees entered combat with fewer hours and less confidence, facing opponents whose aircraft combined speed, endurance, and firepower in a way no previous generation had encountered. It was not a single technological superiority that broke the Luftwaffe, but the cumulative effect of many, and at the center of those effects lay the Browning .50, projecting the same stable, lethal trajectory from bomber turrets, fighter wings, and ground mounts alike. As the air war tilted decisively, analysts began to recognize a mathematical truth beneath the chaos. The M2 had become the axis around which Allied aerial strategy rotated. It shaped escort doctrine, defined engagement ranges, and dictated the pace of the air campaign. The gun did not merely accompany the bombers, it extended their reach and amplified their survival. And as Germany searched for ways to reclaim the initiative, another question emerged with growing urgency. What happens when a weapon becomes not just a tool of war, but the architecture of an entire military strategy? In the winter of 1944, the Ardennes forest became a maze of mist, snow, and muffled footsteps. German commanders believed the terrain favored them, dense trees, narrow roads, and sloping valleys that concealed movement until the moment of impact. Their counteroffensive depended on surprise and the rapid collapse of thin American lines. But as infantry massed beneath the dark canopy preparing to strike, they met a resistance they had not expected, the deep, rhythmic hammering of the M2. Hidden behind snowbanks, log emplacements, and armored vehicles, American crews opened fire through the forest, and the guns' heavy rounds pierced the stillness with a force that reshaped the battle within minutes. The Germans soon discovered that the half-frozen trunks, which they had counted on for concealment, provided little protection. The .50 caliber bullet did not splinter wood so much as carve through it, sending jagged fragments into the air and revealing silhouettes that moments earlier had been invisible. Trees that had shielded soldiers from rifle and machine gun fire now betrayed them. Each burst of M2 fire cut channels through the forest, stripping away the illusion of cover that the Ardennes had always promised. In diaries recovered later, German infantrymen wrote with stark clarity, "The forest was no refuge. The big American gun seized through it." Armor, too, suffered under its reach. Many of the vehicles committed to the offensive, half-tracks, reconnaissance cars, and light support tanks, were designed for speed and mobility, not to withstand half-inch projectiles traveling at immense velocity. Even when angled, their plating ruptured under concentrated fire. Crews attempting to maneuver forward found their vision ports shattered, their tracks damaged, their engines struck by rounds meant originally for aircraft. A weapon built for the sky now shaped the fate of armored thrusts on frozen ground. American engineers, positioned at critical crossroads, used the M2 with disciplined precision. Their task was simple and dangerous: hold the junctions long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Artillery fire crashed around them, sending columns of ice and soil into the air. Yet the M2S continued firing, their barrels steady, their tracers forming straight lines across the drifting snow. In these moments, the gun served not just as a weapon, but as an anchor, providing direction in a battle where confusion often traveled faster than orders. German diaries recorded the experience of advancing into these arcs of fire. Counterattacks that began with confidence dissolved under the weight of a weapon they could neither outrange nor silence. Soldiers described how formations broke apart before the first 100 meters. Mortar teams fell before they could deploy. Machine gun nests, dragged across icy ground, were caught in long bursts that left no time for adjustment. The phrase, repeated across multiple accounts, was simple: the heavy American gun. No designation, no technical name, just a recognition of the force that stopped their momentum. At night, the battlefield revealed itself in a way few had seen before. Tracer lines from the M2 carved long red arcs across the darkness, illuminating the geometry of the fight. Every burst exposed the direction of advance, the shape of the road, the distance between foxholes. For American units, these arcs acted like a compass, marking where friends and enemies moved. For German forces, they created a sense of exposure, brief, brilliant moments in which the path ahead became visible, and in that visibility became perilous. The forest, so often ruled by shadows, now carried the faint glow of lines drawn in fire. As the counteroffensive faltered, the deeper truth came into focus. The Americans were not merely holding ground, they were reclaiming the initiative. With the M2 integrated into their defenses, their motorized columns, and their ad hoc strongpoints, they won the capacity to dictate the pace of battle. Mobility, once the hallmark of German warfare, now shifted to the side that could suppress threats before they emerged and break attacks before they cohered. And as the winter campaign unfolded, one reality became unmistakable. The gun that had shaped the air war was now reshaping the ground war as well, foreshadowing the broader collapse of Germany's ability to regain momentum. The next section reveals how that collapse accelerated. As American firepower matured into a coherent system, aircraft, vehicles, ships, and infantry all linked through a single, versatile weapon, German engineers searched for an answer. On drafting tables in Tempelhof, Spandau, and Oberndorf, proposals took shape. Heavier machine guns, experimental cartridges, hybrid recoil mechanisms meant to rival the stability of Browning's design. Yet none progressed beyond limited prototypes. Each project collided with shortages of steel, labor, or time. What emerged was not a countermeasure, but a pattern of ideas that never reached the battlefield. Attempts to adapt existing mounts offered little relief. The Lafetten tripod, which had served the MG-34 and MG-42 so well in static roles, resisted modification. It shook under heavier calibers, absorbed recoil poorly, and required redesigns that Germany no longer had the resources to pursue. Even if a new weapon could be produced, the systems that allowed it to function, mounts, optics, spare barrels, training manuals, would need to be reinvented alongside it. In a war increasingly shaped by logistics, such reinvention was an impossibility measured not just in engineering skill, but in fuel, manpower, and hours that Germany no longer had. Ammunition shortages deepened the impasse. By 1944, the industrial strain that had already limited cannon production now constricted the manufacture of large-caliber rounds. The Luftwaffe struggled to supply its own 20 and 30 shells. The Army's anti-aircraft units rationed ammunition to preserve dwindling stocks. Introducing a new heavy machine gun would require millions of cartridges, brass, powder, primers, assembly lines, and trained workers. None could be delivered at the scale required. A weapon without ammunition was no weapon at all. At the front, panzer commanders sent urgent reports requesting heavier anti-aircraft armament for their vehicles. The threat posed by Allied aircraft, each bearing the now familiar Browning signature, made survival increasingly dependent on vehicles' ability to respond. Yet production bottlenecks meant that most armored units continued to rely on the very guns that had proved insufficient. Occasional units received 20 mounts or quadruple MG arrays, but these arrived in numbers too small to influence the broader campaign. The gap between what commanders needed and what factories could produce widened with every month. Luftwaffe engineers faced their own dilemma. To counter the streams of .50 caliber fire cutting through the skies, they tested armored plates around cockpits and fuel tanks. The added protection worked in theory. But in practice, these reinforcements slowed aircraft at a moment when speed had become survival. A fighter weighed down with armor climbed poorly, turned slowly, and lost the few advantages it still possessed. Pilots already confronting long-range escorts now entered combat at a disadvantage created not by enemy fire, but by their own attempts at defense. Berlin, inundated with frontline reports, understood the problem with clarity that bordered on helplessness. Multiple communications urged the development of a German equivalent to the .50 caliber machine gun, something reliable, repeatable, and adaptable. But the industrial base that could have answered such a request in 1938 no longer existed in 1944. Bombing campaigns disrupted production schedules, raw materials disappeared into emergency repairs, and entire factories were lost to shortages or evacuation. The question of matching American standardization was not merely difficult, it was obsolete. What Germany faced was not the challenge of building a single weapon, but of matching a philosophy that united simplicity with scale. The M2 existed not just as a machine, but as the center of a system, one that connected workshops in the United States to battlefields in Europe with seamless interchangeability. It was the kind of advantage that could not be improvised under pressure. By the time German planners recognized this truth, the war's momentum had already passed beyond their reach. And so the response never came. Designs remained on paper, factories faltered. The front absorbed the consequences. In the next section, the human impact of this absence, the shifting morale, the psychological weight of fighting without an answer, comes into sharp focus. By the spring of 1945, Germany's military structure collapsed under the accumulated weight of exhaustion, destruction, and strategic overreach. Yet even as Berlin fell, one of the most telling measures of the war's technological legacy came not from weapons that vanished with the Reich, but from a weapon that endured. The M2 Browning, designed in the twilight of one world conflict and vindicated in the heart of another, entered the post-war era unchanged. It required no replacement, no sweeping redesign, no apology for its age. Only months after the guns fell silent in Europe, American technicians prepared the same weapon for the mountains of Korea and later for the jungles of Vietnam. The continuity spoke for itself. Captured German reports, studied by Allied intelligence after the war, revealed an unfiltered frustration. Infantry officers wrote that the .50 caliber machine gun disrupted movement, shattered cover, and denied avenues of approach with a consistency that no German weapon could match. Its psychological weight rivaled its physical effects. In dozens of accounts, the M2 appeared not as an incidental threat, but as one of the most feared pieces of American equipment, an obstacle that reshaped tactics and forced units to adapt on the battlefield. For those who had fought beneath its arcs of fire, the memory lingered. Luftwaffe documents reflected a similar reckoning. Analysts tasked with understanding the collapse of German air defenses ranked the Browning .50 among the top contributing factors to their failure. It was not that the gun alone defeated the Reich's Air Force, but that its placement across bombers and escort fighters created a defensive envelope that rendered traditional interception tactics obsolete. The streams of fire converging from dozens of guns, each operating with reliability at high altitude, shattered the assumptions upon which German aerial doctrine rested. In debriefings, pilots spoke of moments when entire plans dissolved into the realization that they could not approach the bombers without passing through an atmosphere altered by American firepower. In the years that followed, NATO conducted extensive studies on heavy machine guns, evaluations that included new weapons, new ammunition, and emerging theories of mechanized warfare. Yet these studies consistently returned to a single benchmark, the M2. Its combination of range, reliability, and adaptable mounting defied improvement. Machines built decades later struggled to surpass a gun designed before the Great Depression. Engineers who approached the problem from fresh angles often discovered, to their quiet surprise, that Browning's principles had already arrived at solutions they intended to rediscover. Nations rebuilding in the wake of the war faced a practical choice: create new designs from scratch or adopt what had proven itself across continents. Many chose the latter. Some produced direct copies, differing only in minor tooling. Others created derivatives that echoed the M2's proportions and mechanical rhythm. Still others imported the weapon outright, confident that political borders did not diminish its utility. In jungles, deserts, mountains, and Arctic outposts, the M2 became a fixture, not an artifact of American strategy alone, but a global standard. Its longevity revealed something deeper than technical endurance. Here was a weapon that embodied industrial logic, a principle that simplicity, when perfected, yields longevity greater than complexity can hope to match. Browning's design avoided the fragility that plagued more refined mechanisms. It embraced weight, leverage, and timing in proportions that balanced each other. It accepted the realities of mud, sand, heat, and cold without demanding conditions be altered on its behalf. In doing so, it became something rare in military history, a machine equally at home in past wars, present conflicts, and future doctrines. As historians examined the arc of its life, a pattern emerged. Many weapons defined the moments for which they were built. Few survived beyond them. The M2 stood apart. It did not belong to a single front or a single army or a single generation. It bridged eras, serving in wars of industrial attrition, ideological confrontation, and asymmetrical conflict, all without surrendering its identity. And so, in the long view of history, the judgment became clear. This was not a gun of a moment. This was a gun of generations. Decades after the war, when interviews were no longer guided by propaganda or the urgency of fresh wounds, German veterans spoke with a remarkable consistency about the American .50 caliber machine gun. Their recollections did not rise in pitch or stray into embellishment. Instead, they carried a quiet, precise dread, an emotional clarity that time had sharpened rather than softened. Many remembered the weapon not as a blur of battlefield chaos, but as a series of distinct impressions. The heavy rhythm, the inability to measure distance before impact, the sense that once its rounds began striking, events unfolded in a way no decision could alter. Fear, in their descriptions, was not panic. It was the awareness of inevitability. Luftwaffe pilots echoed this tone. Long after the roar of engines and the flash of cannon fire had faded into memory, the sound that remained with them was the sharp percussion of .50 caliber hits striking metal. Explosions were loud, but they were momentary, chaotic bursts followed by silence. The Browning's impact, by contrast, came as a series of rapid, disciplined knocks, each one announcing a loss of control. A fuel line severed, a control cable cut, a wing beginning to fail. Pilots described those moments almost clinically, yet beneath their words lay a truth they did not need to state outright. The weapon stripped away the illusion that skill alone could guarantee survival. Infantrymen who had fought in France, Belgium, and beyond spoke in similar terms. The M2, they said, removed hope from terrain. A fold in the earth, a stone wall, a forest's edge, features that once offered protection became uncertain under the weight of its fire. The gun reached into spaces previously considered safe and flattened the distinctions between open ground and cover. One veteran described it with a phrase that lingered in post-war interviews. There was no safe angle. Not because the weapon was indiscriminate, but because it obeyed physical laws with such precision that terrain ceased to offer the ambiguity upon which survival often depends. American crews, reflecting on their own experience, recalled something different yet complementary. They spoke not of dread, but of steadiness. The M2 became the point around which defensive lines cohered, the instrument that allowed positions to hold when circumstances collapsed. In snowstorms, under artillery fire in the narrow streets of ruined cities, the gun acted as a constant, reliable in ways that transcended the chaos around it. Crews remembered the feel of its charging handle, the weight of its barrel, the knowledge that if everything else failed, the M2 would continue to function. The sense of control it provided was not a boast, but a reassurance woven into the memory of battles where control was often fleeting. Historians analyzing these accounts found a striking pattern. The fear inspired by the M2 did not arise from cruelty or spectacle. It came instead from mechanical inevitability, the quality of a machine that performed its purpose with such consistency that resistance felt futile. Where other weapons relied on conditions, luck, or complex maintenance, the M2 relied on principles, timing, mass, and the physics of recoil. Its lethality was not emotional, it was mathematical. And soldiers on all sides recognized the difference. Over time, the weapon evolved into an emblem of American industrial war-making philosophy. Its longevity reflected an approach that valued standardization, interchangeability, and the idea that a single tool, perfected early, could shape multiple domains of conflict. It stood as a reminder that technological superiority need not come from novelty. Sometimes it emerged from refinement, a design stripped of excess until only permanence remained. Thus the fear that once surrounded the M2 transformed. Veterans who had fought against it and soldiers who had fought behind it spoke of the weapon not simply as an instrument of destruction, but as a lesson in design. Respect replaced dread, and memory gave the weapon a place not only in the history of battles, but in the broader understanding of how nations shape machines and how machines in turn shape memory. The M2 Browning was never a perfect weapon, not in the way engineers sometimes imagine perfection, as lightness without compromise or elegance without effort. It was heavy, stubborn, and demanding. Its barrel weighed as much as some entire rifles. Its recoil could jar the shoulders of an inexperienced gunner. Its components required strength, patience, and deliberate movement, yet perfection was never its purpose. What the M2 offered instead was something far rarer in the history of warfare. A design so fundamentally sound that it endured across eras, not because it avoided difficulty, but because it mastered inevitability. Across continents and climates, it shaped doctrine in ways that few weapons ever do. Armies reorganized fields of fire around its reach. Aircraft designers accommodated its mass because the alternative, anything less, risked losing the sky. Naval officers placed it along the rails of ships to guard the last moments before impact. Infantry commanders used it to hold positions that might otherwise have fractured. The M2 became a constant in a world defined by rapid change, a tool that tied together decades of evolving strategy with a mechanical rhythm that scarcely shifted. In the years after the war, German engineers reviewing combat reports were forced into a rare acknowledgement. They concluded that the weapon's efficiency, its balance of power, reliability, and adaptability, was unmatched by anything their factories had produced. This was not an admission made lightly. German engineering culture prized refinement, precision, and specialization, yet wartime analysis revealed that complexity had become a liability. Designs that excelled in controlled settings faltered in the mud, sand, and cold where battles were actually fought. The M2 succeeded not because it outclassed its opponents in sophistication, but because it did not need to. The decisive battles shaped by the gun were not moments of spectacle, but moments of consistency. A bomber turret that continued firing after hours in sub-zero temperatures. A half-track crew that held a crossroads under artillery fire because their weapon never jammed. A fighter pilot who knew that a short, disciplined burst would reach its mark without guessing at trajectory or range. Victory in these episodes flowed not from dramatic gestures, but from steady reliability, the quiet endurance that allowed strategy to stand when circumstances threatened to break it. Historians long after the war would draw a broader lesson. They observed that military innovation often arrives clothed in ambition, new calibers, exotic mechanisms, technologies that promise revolutions. Yet the M2 embodied the opposite truth. The simplest tools, those refined through repetition and stripped of unnecessary fragility, often outlast the grandest designs. In this sense, the weapon became more than material. It became a statement about the relationship between human intention and mechanical form. When a machine aligns with the realities of war rather than the ideals of theory, it earns longevity that theory cannot predict. A century after its conception, the M2 remains in service, not as a ceremonial relic, but as a functional instrument mounted on vehicles, ships, and aircraft around the globe. Soldiers born generations after the Second World War train on it with the same motions their predecessors learned. Armorers maintain it with the same tools. Doctrine still acknowledges its presence as a factor that shapes tactics, whether in open desert or dense city streets. Few weapons have crossed that span of time without reinvention. Fewer still have done so without surrendering relevance. And so the M2's legacy rests not in the fear it once inspired, but in the clarity it ultimately revealed. It demonstrated that endurance can be engineered, that reliability can shape wars as decisively as breakthroughs, and that simplicity, when elevated to purpose, can outlast the ambitions of empires.